For nearly 700 years, spanning from the 12th to the 19th centuries, Japan was under the rule of shoguns. This era, known as the Age of the Samurai, marked a significant period in the formation of modern Japan. Interestingly, it was also a time when new ideas about love, marriage, and sexual culture emerged. In this video, we will delve into the intriguing aspects of love, marriage, divorce, and sexual culture during the Shogunate era in Japan. If you enjoy content like this, please show your support by liking and subscribing to Time Capsule for more fascinating topics. While it is true that numerous love stories exist from this period, it is important to note that love itself did not hold great significance in the institution of marriage or sexual relationships for the majority of the Shogunate period. In the early stages, marriage in Japan was a loosely defined concept. It did not involve elaborate ceremonies or a legal contract, but rather served as a social agreement between couples. Even cohabitation between spouses was a relatively new aspect of marriage during the 12th and 13th centuries. In fact, the modern ideas and customs surrounding marriage were still in the process of being shaped, resulting in diverse approaches across different time periods and social classes. Elites and commoners held contrasting views on marriage. For the average Japanese person, marriage did not entail much complexity initially. A couple would simply decide to live together, consider themselves married, and perhaps celebrate with a small gathering. However, as laws pertaining to inheritance and property became more stringent, marriage evolved into an economic consideration as well. Parents and families began to play a role in deciding suitable unions, and contracts started to be drawn up between families to discuss the exchange of property and wealth accompanying the marriage. Various limitations and requirements were imposed as well. For instance, in many regions, marrying someone from a different region was deemed illegal. However, given that most individuals rarely ventured beyond their own region, kayakuenkan, another complication arose in the form of kayakuenkan, which referred to the marriage of a widow to her deceased husband's older brother. While this practice was forbidden for samurai, it was permitted, and in some cases, even required by law for commoners. This practice aimed to ensure that the wife remained within the family. For the elite class, marriage always carried economic and political implications. Parents typically took the lead in arranging marriages for their children, treating them as strategic maneuvers to secure or enhance the family's position. When a couple married, the woman became a part of the man's family. Consequently, both sides of the arrangement sought assurance that their daughter would be well taken care of, or that the new daughter-in-law would bring value to her new family. Thus, the institution of marriage during the Shogunate era in Japan was shaped by a blend of social, economic, and political factors. Love, though not entirely absent, did not occupy a central role in marriages or sexual relationships during this time. As we explore the fascinating intricacies of this period, we gain valuable insights into the cultural evolution of Japan and the diverse perspectives on love, marriage, divorce, and sexual culture that prevailed during the Age of the Samurai. Yoshi and Yume. One exception to the prevailing marriage customs was the practice of yoshi and yumi, or adoptive marriages. In these cases, a man would marry into the wife's family. This was a rare occurrence, but could happen when the family lacked a son of their own to inherit their titles and property. Interestingly, while the adoption and marriage were intertwined, in many of these marriages, a prenuptial agreement known as promistic room was drawn up. This agreement stipulated a portion of the family's assets that would be given to the groom if the marriage failed. Ultimately, it was the bride's father who had the authority to decide whether to annul the adoption agreement. Thus, it was not unheard of for a man to divorce his wife and still retain her family's wealth. For marriages among the elite class, certain protocols had to be followed. Approval from one's direct feudal lord was necessary, and it was prohibited for families serving different regional lords, known as daimyo, to intermarry. Additionally, potential couples had to belong to a similar social status to maintain the delicate social order. One of the most crucial aspects of a new marriage among the elites was the dowry. This exchange of wealth from the wife to the husband played a significant role in marriage negotiations, and a generous dowry increased the likelihood of a successful match. The most powerful daimyo paid hefty sums for elaborate dowries for their daughters, with some dowries becoming so extensive that the groom had to allocate an entire room in his house to accommodate all the gifts. Bridal manuals from that period provide a glimpse into the items one might expect to find in a dowry, such as pottery, jewelry, folding screens, musical instruments, incense, clothing, books, painting, and calligraphy supplies, or tea sets, to name a few. The transfer of the dowry became an event in itself, with parades of servants carrying these precious gifts from the bride's house to the groom's house. The average Japanese bride might not bring a dowry at all, or if she did, it would be a modest amount that did not significantly impact the marriage. Later in the Shogunate period, laws were enacted to restrict the ostentatious displays of wealth allowed by commoners in their dowries. During this period, wedding ceremonies also began to emerge, although they were primarily limited to the elite class due to the time and financial resources required. These ceremonies were social gatherings rather than religious events, since the religious concept of weddings did not emerge in Japan until the late 19th century. Nevertheless, they involved numerous rituals and traditions. Initially, Japanese weddings took place at night. By the 17th century, they shifted to daytime ceremonies. Koshi-ire. During the Shogunate era, many familiar elements of modern Japanese weddings began to emerge. For instance, brides typically wore white kimonos and headdresses. Wealthier brides might even be carried to their husbands' homes on a palanquin in a grand procession known as koshi-ire. The wedding ceremony itself featured the ritualistic drinking of sake, symbolizing unity, followed by the bride changing into a new outfit gifted by the groom, representing her new place in his family. One noteworthy tradition among the wealthiest families was keok-watashi. This involved the bride's family presenting a box of decorated shells to the groom's family. Each shell would be adorned with a part of an artistic pattern or poem. The shells would then be broken and placed inside the box, symbolizing the coming together of the newlywed couple to complete the picture. Adultery. Married life during this period followed conventional expectations. Men held the power in the household, and having children was an essential aspect of a married couple's life. Monogamy was strictly enforced for women, but men, particularly the wealthy, might have concubines or frequent brothels if they were of lower social standing. Adultery by a woman was considered a severe crime, punishable by death. The standard punishment was for both the woman and the man she had relations with to be put to death. In earlier centuries, the law required the offenders to take their own lives, but this requirement was later dropped. Husbands were allowed, but not obligated, to carry out the execution. It was even permissible for the family or village of the husband to execute an unfaithful wife and her lover on his behalf if he was absent when the scandal was revealed. In 1742, Tokugawa Yoshimune issued an extensive set of laws that covered various adulterous scenarios. For example, a man attempting to seduce another man's wife would face the death penalty. A couple planning to commit adultery would be banished. If a woman killed her husband to conceal her affair, she would be publicly humiliated and then crucified. The severity of these laws reflected the belief that marriage played a crucial role in maintaining social order. Adultery was seen as a disruption to the balance of Japanese society and an act of rebellion against the authority of the husband. The importance of social order in marriage laws is further evident in the fact that punishments were more severe when the adulterous couple belonged to different social classes. However, the treatment of adultery varied between commoners and elites. While the laws demanded execution, commoners often preferred to negotiate through the affair without resorting to killing. After all, if adultery was considered a crime against social order, killing two individuals within the village or community would be even more detrimental. Instead of execution, the offending couple would face public shame and potential banishment. Taking their lives was generally considered too extreme for commoners. If you are enjoying the content so far, then consider liking the video and subscribing. Divorce. Divorce was an inevitable outcome for commoners caught in scandals, and it was relatively easy to obtain without significant social stigma. As a general rule, when a divorce occurred, any children from the marriage remained with the husband, while the wife returned to her own family. While reliable records of divorce rates among commoners are scarce, data suggests that approximately 10% of daimyo marriages ended in divorce during the late Shogunate period. However, this does not imply that the remaining 90% of marriages were necessarily happy. Undoubtedly, many elites entered into marriages solely for economic gain and conveniently sent their wives off to a state where they would never have to see them again. During the Shogunate era, divorce carried certain obligation, and the power to divorce was almost exclusively held by men. By providing her with a mikudare han, or a brief document indicating his intent to divorce, and the woman had no means to dispute it. However, by the Edo period, the principle of the return of the dowry was widely respected in Japanese society. This meant that a husband had to return the dowry to his wife if he divorced her. However, this process could be more complex than it initially seemed. Often, people had already spent the dowry, necessitating alternative means to cover the cost. Some men resorted to borrowing money or sought another wife with a larger dowry to make up the difference. For elites, these dowries could be exorbitantly expensive. If a man could not afford to repay the dowry, he effectively became unable to divorce his wife. Sayings and poems from this period often depicted individuals trapped in marriages solely because they could not afford to repay the dowry and escape. Even in cases where there was no dowry, it was expected for the husband to provide a small settlement to the wife as a gesture of respect, especially in fujitsuren, or bad faith divorces, where the husband's actions had caused a scandal forced the end of the marriage. There were situations where a woman could initiate a divorce. One such instance was through seik watashi reinjo, which roughly translates to advanced letters of divorce. These documents, similar to the mikudare han, demanded a divorce and were given by the husband to his wife as a form of insurance. If the wife felt that the husband was behaving wrongly, she could present the letter to him and dissolve the union. Sometimes, these letters were written during the marriage negotiation and handed over to the wife's family. If the husband failed to take care of her, her family could step in and use the letters to dissolve the marriage. Divorce itself was not considered dishonorable, although the reasons behind it might be. People could generally remarry without issue. According to available records, most daimyo divorces were followed by remarriage to someone else. However, anyone who remarried without finalizing a divorce could face punishment. A man who remarried without properly divorcing his previous wife would be exiled, while the woman would have her head shaved as a symbol of her crime and would be sent back to live with her parents. Sexual culture. During the Shogunate era in Japan, there was a remarkable acceptance of various types of sexuality. Homosexuality was widely tolerated for both men and women, and there were no punishments specifically targeting it, as was the case in Europe during the same period. This sexual openness is evident in popular literature from the time. Renowned 17th century poet Iara Seikaku frequently wrote about romance and sexual culture. His work, The Life of an Amorous Man, described a man who had thousands of lovers, including hundreds of men. Similarly, in The Life of an Amorous Woman, Seikaku depicted lesbian relationship. However, it is important to note that while homosexuality was accepted in terms of sexual dynamics and occasionally romantic connections, marriage remained strictly between a man and a woman. Homosexuality was strongly associated with the upper classes of society. In a 17th century story called The Boar's Tale, a group of men debated whether loving a woman or a young man was better. While they agreed that a woman was ultimately the preferred choice, they also believed that loving young men was more suitable for the warrior aristocracy. The most common manifestation of this elite homosexuality was the non-shoku tradition, which paired older mentors with younger boy students. The older men acted as mentors, teaching their young apprentices about politics and war, often with a sexual element involved. It was believed that such relationships deepened the bond between teacher and student and had a positive influence on the young boys. Many Japanese elites, including famous warlords like Tokugawa Ieyasu and Oda Nobunaga were known to have both male and female lovers throughout their lives. As time went on, the practice of nankoku spread beyond the samurai classes and began to be embraced by the upper middle classes, such as merchants. While the long-term mentoring aspect was challenging to replicate, the sexual relationships were easier to emulate. During the Tokugawa period, non-shoku relationships became more common in brothels. The commercialization of the nankoku tradition played a significant role in the expansion of prostitution across Japan. Throughout the Shogunate era, prostitution was legal in designated pleasure zones. As cities grew and Japan's middle class expanded, prostitution became increasingly prevalent. The average prostitute, known as ojo, worked in the pleasure districts of cities and towns. Prostitution was not considered dishonorable, and some prostitutes gained high regard. The most famous were known as oran, who became local celebrities, commanding higher prices and often becoming mistresses of local elites. Individuals from various professions, including kabuki dancers, also engaged in prostitution on the side. One of the most well-known figures in this context were the geisha girls, who emerged in the mid-18th century. Geishas were primarily entertainers skilled in various artistic pursuits, such as drama, poetry, music, and song. Strictly speaking, geishas were not prostitutes, and it was often forbidden for them to provide sexual services. However, many did so anyway. By the early 19th century, geishas had become symbols of fashion and femininity, replacing traditional courtesans and becoming the preferred source of sexual and non-sexual entertainment for many elites. Thanks for watching the video. We won't request the repayment of any dowries, but we would be immensely grateful if you could show your support by liking the video and subscribing to our channel. We look forward to sharing more knowledge with you in the future. Until then, take care.